Welcome to the next lesson in the Animal Behavior online course. This week we are going to be learning all about how animals move around the world, from transcontinental migrations to jellyfish to swimming up and down the water column. I hope this lesson really shows you just how well animals can navigate and travel. All right, so let's go ahead and begin. All right, so take a second to think about what you think of when you hear the word migration. Go ahead and write down a couple ideas. It can be about humans or animals, it doesn't really matter. Just kind of jot down some of the general thoughts about what you think of when you hear that term. Okay, all right, well, hopefully we're all thinking about it in a very similar way. But here's the definition that we're actually going to continue using for the rest of the class. Migration is the seasonal movement of animals from one region to another. This is usually a long distance movement, but not always. For instance, some animals will migrate with light cycles less than 100 feet. Migration does involve a return, though, so the animal must go from one place and then return at a later date and time. This is different from what is known as dispersal, which is sort of the permanent movement of animals to a new region. Dispersal is common in primates, for example. They'll start out in one group where they're born, that's their natal group, but then once they grow up and become sexually mature, they will move out and form a new group or join an already existing group. And so that is dispersal because those monkeys are unlikely to ever return back to their group. All right, so within migration and dispersal, there are two vocabulary words that we really need to be aware of. Typically, these are used in terms of migration, but they also could be used in terms of dispersal as well. So the first term is immigration. We've probably all heard this word before. This is a verb that indicates an animal moves into a new habitat or location. Now, the flip side of immigration is emigration. And this verb basically means that an animal or a population moves away from a previous habitat or location. So, for example, if you are not a citizen of the United States and you want to become a citizen of the United States, you would be immigrating into the country. However, if you are a current citizen and you want to move away from the country, that would be the term emigration. So you're emigrating out of the country. Now, like I said, animals move in two very different categorical ways. They either disperse or they migrate, but today's focus is going to be on migration. All right, so take a second and think about why animals might need to move. Once again, go ahead and write some down, some ideas or some examples, and try when you're writing to remember a major theme of this class, which is thinking about animal behavior in terms of costs and benefits. All right, so once you've jotted up some ideas, let's go ahead and talk about why an animal may migrate. An animal may migrate for some of these main reasons here. So, for example, maybe they migrate because they're lacking food or resources. Maybe the climate becomes too cold. You'll see that in a lot of bird species, as well as old people as well. Once it gets too cold in the north, they'll then migrate down south to Florida. Sometimes it's to find a mate or reproduce. And then there are other instances like overpopulation or natural disasters that can cause an animal to move. So here is our first organism that we're going to take a look at, and I chose it because it has a really unique reason to migrate. This first example is the golden jellyfish. Now, a lot of animals that migrate do so on an annual basis, but this jellyfish species actually migrates every single day. When the sun rises each morning, they all swim to the surface of the lake that they live in, and then at sunset, they'll swim deeper and deeper, which helps them to avoid predators that would normally prey on them at the surface of the water. Now, the reason they do this is because inside of all of these jellyfish, there's like an algae-like organism known as a zooxanthellae, and these algae organisms perform photosynthesis, and in return for doing photosynthesis, they provide the jellyfish with energy. So it's an example of a cooperation, specifically a byproduct mutualism. Both organisms are benefiting from the reaction simultaneously. But in order for them to do photosynthesis, they need to be at the surface of the lake. And so the jellyfish basically is like, I need energy, so I'm going to swim to the surface of the lake and receive the photosynthesis so that I can get this energy. Now, there's definitely no cognition going on there. They're not making a deliberate decision. This is definitely sort of a pre-hardwired genetic migration of going up and down each day, but there are advantages, right? The advantage is that you can get better energy because the algae that's living inside you can photosynthesize better. but there's also cost, right? So going to the surface of the water means that predators are going to potentially attack you, right? Because you're closer to the surface where there's more predators. And so that's why they move back down during nighttime, because there's no advantage to being at the surface of the water. So at nighttime, they go back down and away from the predators. Really interestingly, and I really like this example because it highlights an environmental impact of migration. So this circular motion pattern of the jellyfish going up and down every single day churns up the water, and it moves the nutrient-rich water from that's down below up to the surface to really help the ecosystem. And so let me go ahead and show you exactly what that looks like here in a second. So here is the water column. The jellyfish will start out during nighttime. They're going to be really, really deep in the water column. But then once it becomes daytime, they will all rise up to the surface of the water so that the algae living inside them can photosynthesize and produce energy for the jellyfish. Then once it becomes nighttime again, they're all going to sink back down to the deeper depths where there are less predators. And so ultimately, this cycling of going up and coming back down and then eventually going back up again will basically churn the nutrients in the water column and produce this really, really cool cycle. And so this is a really, really unique example of almost like a triadic byproduct mutualism, right? So the algae and the jellyfish are working together and they're forming a mutually beneficial relationship. But then on top of that, the entire ecosystem benefits from this mutualistic interaction. So in a way, this is sort of a third tier or third order mutualistic interaction. All right, so here is another example of why an animal may need to migrate. Beluga whales are another example of a migratory animal. They live in the Arctic waters, and at least some populations migrate, although there are some that do not. So basically, when the summer ice melts the sea ice, they will make their way up into warmer, more shallow estuaries. For some populations, this migration can be almost 4,000 miles long. And so, real quick, take a second. Why might the belugas be migrating once the sea ice melts and allows them to get into these warm, shallow estuaries? What might be a reason for that? All right, so if you haven't had a chance to think about that, go ahead and pause the video. But the reason they seem to migrate is because these estuaries are a safe place for them to reproduce and give birth to calves. And so belugas are a seasonal migratory animal, and they will migrate for their breeding season. And this also is really helpful because the main number one predator for belugas are orca whales. And these orca whales, because they're much larger than belugas, won't actually swim up into these shallow, warmer estuaries. And so these estuaries provide a really, really safe environment for the belugas to give birth to their calves and to be there and thrive while they are pregnant with their calves, and then once their calves are born, to protect them. So basically, it really protects the organisms, the beluga whales, when they're in a very vulnerable state. Additionally, there's also research to suggest that the warm waters can stimulate their metabolism, so there may be other benefits as well. But I wanted to highlight this example because beluga migration is directly tied to climate change. And so as the sea surface temperatures begin to heat up, this really may begin to disrupt beluga migration. They rely on those temperatures as a cue to migrate, and they also rely on the heating up during the summer to melt the ice to give access to these estuaries. And so as the world continues to heat up through global warming and the sea surface temperatures continue to rise, their migration may be really, really negatively affected. And so this just really highlights that this is an example of a negative impact of human climate change effects and stuff like that. So really wanted to highlight that as an important key for this migration unit. Now, okay, so those are just two examples of why animals may migrate. There are a bunch more, but those are the ones I really wanted to highlight for today. And I hope that they really highlight that animals can migrate for very different reasons, very different distances, and all sorts of potential mechanisms that are leading to that. But now we're going to go over the two different types of migratory animals. The first type are obligatory migrators. And these migrators are basically, they engage in a form of migration that occurs at predictable times in response to predictable stimuli. It's typically referred to as hardwired migration because there's often a genetic component to it, but basically it's regular, consistent, and predictable. Examples of this would be basically a mating season, like we just talked about with the belugas, or maybe like birds flying south for the winter to avoid the cold, right? This is a very regular, predictable migration pattern. The second type of migration is a facultative migration or a facultative migrator. This migration occurs in response to environmental conditions. So sometimes the migration occurs and sometimes it doesn't, and it's really irregular, inconsistent, and quite honestly unpredictable. For example, a lot of animals in the African savanna will migrate during the dry season, but the dry season is not always predictable in those instances. Or, for example, another thing that can happen, I don't know how familiar you are all with what's known as an El Nino year, but this is a certain period of time of environmental instability, and it happens every so often. And so that some animals have been shown to migrate only in El Nino years, and so these would be known as facultative migrators. All right, so here are the features of an obligatory migrant. First, individuals leave before the food resources are absent, meaning so they'll leave even though their pantry is full. Timing is consistent every single year. They're going about the same time. They have a similar, maybe not identical, but similar behavior pattern each year. Typically, there's a tight genetic control over migration, and usually it's over long distances, but this is not required. A common example of a obligatory migrant is the lesser white-throat. It's a type of bird. We see that in this map pictured here with the letter B on it, that they have a consistent and predictable migration pattern flying from the United Kingdom to the Middle East every single year. This consistent migration pattern is a key pattern that we would see in obligatory migrants. So if you see an animal doing something like this, you can be pretty certain that it is an obligatory migrant and may even be under genetic control. But in order to determine if migration is under some aspect of genetic control, we can actually run an experiment to determine this. And so here's an example of a study that did just this in a different migratory bird. This bird is known as a European blackcap. And basically, this experiment that I'm about to tell you about will give us strong evidence of the genetic basis of migration. So first, their migration location is tightly linked to their population. There are two different kinds of populations. One population will fly southwest every single winter, whereas another population, the red population, will fly southeast every single winter. However, if you breed a hybrid between the red and the blue populations, you actually get a population of birds that will fly directly south during the winter. And so this is a really, really strong component, a really strong suggester that there is a genetic component to their migration because the hybrids are flying south. Now, this component is just one of the two components that seem genetic, though. For example, another component is their timing. There's actually a strong correlation between the parent and offspring of the migration timing. Parents that migrate early often have offspring that migrate early, and parents that migrate late often have offspring that migrate late. Now, this could be potentially due to social learning, but in combination with the hybrid experiment, it suggests that there is a tight genetic component or tight genetic control over the migration pattern of the European blackcap bird. All right, now turning back to facultative migrants. These migrants have the following features. So first, proportions of the population will migrate every year, but not necessarily all of them. There is a distance migrated, and the timing can often be very variable. Individual variation in behavior, like I just talked about. Some individuals will migrate, some individuals won't. Usually it's in direct response to something like a lack of food or a lack of resources. And there's definitely less of a genetic control on migration. Now, a good example is the common redpoll bird, which I think are a cute little chonky bird. But they show us an example of what a facultative migrant might look at. So remember, if you look back to the white-throat graph, you see very consistent migration patterns. However, if you look in this graph, I know it's a little bit hard to see, but there are black dots and then there are white dots. The black dots are from the winter of 1972, and the white dots are from the winter of 1965. And so you can see there's not really a consistent place that they migrate to. It's quite an unpredictable phenomenon. And there's a lot of variation even within the same population. And so this suggests that there's not so much of a genetic component in red pole migration. Instead, there seems to be something like responding to the environment rather than following sort of the hardwired nature of genetics. So up until this point, we've talked about why animals should move. There are a lot of benefits to moving and migrating, but remember, there's usually a cost associated with moving too. So go ahead and take a second to think about why an animal may choose not to move, or why it would be beneficial for an animal not to move or migrate. Go ahead and once again write down some things. Think about what certain costs might occur, and then if you need a little bit more time, go ahead and pause the video. So here are a list of some of the costs. First of all, it's physically demanding, which means it requires energy, right? So you don't want to just migrate if you are not ready and don't have the energy stores to do so. Second, there might be sort of a lack of food or water along the journey. So if you do have reduced energy or not enough energy, you might end up dying along the way. And so that would not be something that would be beneficial. There's also a time cost associated with migration, right? So if you think about it, just like you and I, our time is very valuable, right? And we want to dedicate it to doing things that we love, like doom scrolling on TikTok, perhaps, right? These are things that are very valuable to us. And if instead we have to migrate, like we have to travel, that can really take away from our valuable doom scrolling TikTok time. So animals are the same way. They have things that they need to do. They need to eat. They need to reproduce. They need to groom. They need to be social, right? And so by taking time to migrate, that is a cost to them. And lastly, there's potentially new predators along the route and potentially new predators wherever you're going. So you really run the risk of making the decision to either stay where you are or move. And so when an animal does migrate, basically the decision, evolution and natural selection has said that migration has greater benefits that outweigh these four costs. But there are many animals that do not migrate because these costs are too great and therefore the animals won't migrate, right? So natural selection doesn't favor it. So what are some alternatives to migration? If you're not going to migrate, what might you do? Well, some animals do what is known as hibernation, which I'm sure you're all are familiar with, or the opposite of hibernation. Hibernation occurs in response to cold weather. Estivation occurs in response to warm weather. So here's just a quick example of an animal that does not use migration, but instead uses a different strategy of hibernation and estivation. But for this example, I'm going to show you a little bit more about their estivation. And so this is the kangaroo mouse. They are a very cute, tiny little animal that lives in the very arid desert. They are nocturnal and they do not drink water. Instead, they derive water from the food that they eat because, well, it's a desert and deserts don't have water. Anyways, in deserts, winters can be very, very, very cold. And in the summer, well, this goes without saying, the weather can be very, very hot. So instead of migrating, though, because the kangaroo mouse is teeny tiny, and if it tries to migrate, it's most likely going to get eaten. So instead of that, the kangaroo mouse engages in both hibernation and estivation when climates become too extreme. And so what researchers did is they actually did this really cool thing where they measured the oxygen consumption of a kangaroo mouse in their den. And then they looked at how the oxygen consumption changed with ambient temperature, right? And so we see that as ambient temperature on the x-axis increases and becomes really, really hot. I mean, look at that. We're getting up to 30 and 40 degrees Celsius, which I don't know what the conversion of that is in Fahrenheit because I'm American. But that is really, really hot. And we see that as that's happening, we are getting a significant reduction in oxygen consumption. And oxygen consumption is just a proxy measure for estivation. They are consuming less oxygen as temperatures get really, really hot because all they're doing is basically resting in their dens to avoid the really, really hot temperatures. And so this is an example of estivation. They do the same thing in the winter when it gets really cold, but it's an alternative strategy to migration because if you think about it, this animal, if they try to migrate, they are not going to make it very far. I mean, they're so gosh darn cute and adorable, and I hope that they never get preyed upon. But the reality is they're teeny tiny, and there are lots of animals, snakes, spiders, birds of prey that would take a kangaroo mouse, not think it's so cute, but instead think it's delicious. Now, let's quickly discuss how animals know when it's time to migrate. Unfortunately for animals, they don't have iPhones to set an alarm or access to Google Calendars in order to know what day of the year they need to move. So, how do you guys think the animals know? What are some of the possibilities that they might be paying attention to? Well, the answer can be broken into two main categories, and both of them are not mutually exclusive, which means that they can impact one another. The first category is an internal signal. So things that happen internally in organism's body, like hormones or maybe like a circadian rhythm. And then the second category are external signals. So like maybe the amount of daylight or the amount of temperature, not amount of temperature, that's silly, the temperature of the area that they're living in. Of course, this is pretty obvious how these two might interact. For example, if your resources are low, this might cause certain hormones to be released, which can kind of indicate to the organism that they're hungry, which then ultimately causes the animal to migrate. So here's a really unique way that some organisms know how to move, and that is through overcrowding or a high population density. This little tiny insect is known as a springtail. They're actually very, very small. You can barely see them with the human eye. But they get their name because they have this spring-loaded tail that allows them to propel themselves up and away. Basically, they're like a little mini microscopic pogo stick. Now, some researchers were curious if springtails were able to disperse as a result of overcrowding. And so what they did is they had these three containers that were side by side, and at the top of each container, they were connected through a tube. So the springtails were able to leave the container by jumping with their pogo stick up to the tube and then moving into the next container, something a little bit like this. All right. So then what they did is they measured the dispersal rate when there were just a couple springtails in that original container versus when there were a lot of springtails in the original container. And here is what they found. We see that as the number of springtails in that original container increases, the more springtails disperse. And so this shows us that they were dispersing, in fact, due to the high population density. Now, once again, that was an example of dispersal. That wasn't really migration, right? They're not returning to the same area, but the same mechanism might be at play in migration too, right? And so here's an example of an animal that migrates in the exact same way to the exact same pressures. This is the red-spotted newt. I think he's a cute little guy. These reptiles are mostly aquatic, but sometimes they will migrate out of the water and become terrestrial during the certain seasons. And just like the springtails, a bunch of researchers measured what percentage of the population was migrating each year based on the population densities. The blue dots represent males and the purple dots represent females. We see that on the x-axis, we have population density. And as this goes from low to medium to high, more and more newts are migrating, likely due to overcrowding. And so it's a really cool example that both insects and reptiles might be, or sorry, newts, I believe, are amphibians. Sorry about that. They are kind of reacting to a very, very similar pressure and doing a migration or dispersal for that. Now, I will ask you this. This is a very interesting question to connect to a previous part we talked about this. So would you believe that the red-spotted newt is an obligatory migrant or a facultative migrant based on this data? Okay. Now that you've had a chance to think about it, let's think about what the answer would be. The answer would be they are a facultative migrant, right? They are responding to something in their environment, and sometimes they migrate, sometimes they don't. It's not really a consistent pattern, right? So there's probably not a genetic predisposition to this. They're actually genuinely responding to something in the environment, in this case, the number of newts in the river or the water that they're living in, that's causing some of the newts to then migrate out of the water and become terrestrial. Okay, so migration is one of the most dramatic and challenging behaviors in the animal kingdom, but it always comes down to a simple question. Why move? Animals migrate to find what they can't have where they are. They need food, water, better climate, safe breeding grounds, right? These are all reasons that an animal needs to move. It's an elegant solution to living in a world that changes with the season. But migration isn't free. It's risky, it's exhausting, and it can even be deadly if you run into new predators. So we always have to ask, why not migrate? For some species, the costs outweigh the benefits. If resources are stable or if they can survive the harsh conditions by staying put, hibernating, or estivating, then migration really doesn't make sense. We also saw that not all migrants are the same. Obligatory migrants are hardwired to move, migrating every year without fail. Facultative migrants, on the other hand, are flexible. They decide whether to move based on current conditions. And together, these patterns remind us that migration isn't just movement, it's a behavioral strategy, finely tuned by the evolution, balancing costs and opportunities across both space and time. And I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I hope you found it helpful.